Hello everybody, welcome to Deeksha Online. So now we are going to discuss about the third lecture in sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So we have until now discussed about flower being a fascinating organ in angiosperm. So this is to give you a chapter overview. We will now be discussing about some of the pre-fertilization events. If you remember, we have discussed about microsporogenesis, about megasporogenesis, isn't it? Then we have to discuss about a unique fertilization process called double fertilization. We will also be discussing about post-fertilization structures and events. And lastly, in this chapter, we will be dealing with apomixis and polyembryony. In the last class, we learnt about gynoecium and pistil, parts of a pistil, isn't it? And then we had seen that if the units of gynoecium are free, it is called apocarpus. If the units of gynoecium are fused, it is called syncarpus. We had learnt about the structure of megasporangium or ovule. We had learnt how the megasporangium produces a haploid megaspore, that is through a process called megasporogenesis. We had learnt about the development of female gametophyte or embryo sac inside the megasporangium. And lastly, we had discussed about the structural organization of embryo sac. In this chapter, in this lecture, we will be discussing about pollination. You all are aware that the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the flower is referred to as pollination. Why should pollination be brought about? So that you can bring together the male and the female gamete. So all of you remember, if this is the stigma, the stamen, here you have anther. The anther produces the pollen grain. By now you know that it is the pollen grain which has what in it? Which has the male gamete. And then we have the pistil. In the pistil, you know that in the ovary, you have a structure which is called the ovule. And in the ovule, you have the female gamete. The male gamete in the pollen and the female gamete in the ovule, that is in the embryo sac, are non-motile. They do not move. So how do you bring them together? For that, you have to ensure that the pollen gets deposited on to the stigma of the pistil. And this process where the pollen gets deposited on to the stigma of the pistil is referred to as pollination. So please remember, pollen is the bearer of the male gamete, and inside the ovule, by now you all are aware that there is a structure called the embryo sac, which is the bearer of the female gamete. They cannot move together. As a result, you bring them together by transferring the pollen onto the stigma of the pistil. So why should pollination happen? Very important give reason. In order to be, they have to be brought together for the process of fertilization, which can be achieved through pollination. So the very simple and apt definition of pollination is, it is the mechanism of transfer of pollen grain. From where is the pollen produced? From the anther. And where is it transferred to? It is transferred to the stigma of the pistil. So this process, this mechanism where there is transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma is referred to as pollination. Alright? Now let us come to the types of pollination. The first one is called autogamy. Here in autogamy, see the definition, it is self-explanatory. You are transferring the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Your definition should include this word called same flower. Okay, so pollen is falling onto the stigma of the same flower. For this, what is required? The time duration or the time at which the pollen is released from the anther and the stigma becomes mature should be the same. There should be a there should be a synchrony between the release of the pollen as well as the receptivity of the stigma. And also the stigma and the anther should be very, very close to each other. There should be a close proximity between the stigma and the anther. And because it is happening within the same flower, we can call this process as what? We can call this process as self-pollination. So let us see here. Let me draw a flower for you here. the thalamus, and this is the pistil. Sitting inside the pistil is the ovule. Now we have anther here, and these are the petals. So notice that the anther, that is the stamen, and the pistil are present very close to each other. And important thing to remember here is pollination is happening within the same flower. So I've shown only one flower over here. The anther is very close to the stigma. The anther produces the pollen grain. The pollen grain is deposited on to the stigma of a different flower or same flower. Same flower in this case. So did you understand the concept of autogamy? The anther and the stigma must be close to each other. And a very important thing is the maturity of the anther and the release of the pollen and the receptivity of the stigma. Please remember, there should be a synchrony between the two. There should be a synchrony between the release of pollen and the receptivity of the stigma. Autogamy. In some plants such as Viola, Oxalis and Commelina, they produce two types of flowers. Some of them are called Chasmogamous flowers and some of them are called Cleistogamous flowers. So let me try representing here for you. So this is the thalamus and this is the pistil. And notice how the pistil, that is the stigma, this is the stigma, and the anther are exposed to the outside because the flower is open. The petal opened up, see? And the stigma and the anther are exposed. Such a flower where the stigma and the anther are exposed is called a chasmogamous flowers. Did you understand? Now what if they are not exposed? Say, let me show another diagram for you here. This is the stigma and this is the anther. And the flower doesn't open at all. See how the flower is closed. In this kind of a flower where the flower is closed and the anther and the stigma are not exposed to the outside, we call such flowers as Cleistogamous flowers. So some plants produce two types of flowers, that is flowers whose anther and stigma are exposed, which are referred to as chasmogamous, and flowers whose anther and stamen, that is anther and stigma are not exposed to the outside and they are closed, and such closed flowers are referred to as Cleistogamous. So here you can see in the diagram, the underground flowers, the flowers that are produced underground are Cleistogamous, they are closed, whereas above the ground, the flowers are open and their anther and the stigma are exposed to the outside. Okay. So like I told you, in Cleistogamous flowers, what happens is, let me draw a Cleistogamous flower here. So this is the pistil and this is the anther. Notice how the anther is present very close to the pistil. And now let me cover them because you know that they don't open. So it so happens here that in the bud condition itself, when the flower is still a bud, the anther dehisces to produce the pollen grain. And the pollen obviously will get deposited on to the stigma of the same flower. That's why it is a means of what? It is a means of autogamy. So what you should remember here is, in the bud condition itself, the anther dehisces. The anther dehisces in the bud condition. And also you should remember close proximity between who and who? Close proximity between the anther and the stigma. Isn't it? So anther and stigma are present very close to each other and the flower is not going to open at all. That is, in the bud condition itself, the anther produces the pollen and the pollen gets deposited on to the stigma. This is seen in the case of the closed flower. And what do we call this closed flower? We call it as Cleistogamous flowers. See, I told you they do not open at all. Anther and stigma lie close to each other. When does the anther break open? During the bud condition, and the pollen will come in contact with what? The pollen comes in contact with the stigma. Such flowers are invariably autogamous. A very important give reason question. Why are they always? Invariably means always autogamous. See, it is very obvious that if the flower is closed, can we get pollen from some other flower outside? No chance. So, no chance of cross pollen landing onto the stigma. The pollen that lands on the stigma has to be the pollen from the anther of the same flower. So, there is no chance of cross pollination, because if the flower does not open at all, there is no question of pollen coming from elsewhere. It has to be the stigma and the anther of the same flower. So it is invariably autogamous. Okay? As a result, Cleistogamous flowers produce 100% they produce seeds, even without depending on pollinators. Do they need somebody to help in pollination? Absolutely not, because they don't open. They're always closed. When they're always closed, you know that the anther is very close to the stigma, so the pollen will fall onto the stigma on its own. There is no question of the pollen being carried by the wind elsewhere, and they don't need any honeybee to pollinate them. They don't need pollinators. As a result, almost always they produce seeds, because pollination is most of the times successful in them, because they don't expose their anther and stigma, because they don't open at all, and because the pollen dehisces in the bud condition, and because it lands on the stigma of the same flower. Did you understand? So what are all the things you have to remember about Cleistogamous flowers? They are closed. Then you should remember the anther dehisces in the bud condition. Then you should remember the anther and the stigma, are they far apart or close together? Are in close proximity together. Then we should say they undergo invariably self-pollination. Why invariably self-pollination? Because there is no chance of cross pollen landing on the stigma. If they don't open at all, how can pollen from outside land upon the stigma? And then, like I said, assured seed set. Why assured seed set in spite of not having pollinators? Because obviously pollination is assured, and that means the seed formation is also assured because of the adaptations we just saw of Cleistogamous or closed flowers. The next type of pollination is called Xenogamy. So Xenogamy is the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of another flower, but on the same plant. So isn't it like neighboring flowers? They're growing on the same plant and they are present next to each other. They're neighbors. So if there is exchange of pollen onto the stigma between neighboring flowers of the same plant, so you should not forget to mention that it happens between the same plant, within the same plant, then we call it as what? We call it as Xenogamy. Why is it functionally cross-pollination? It is functionally cross-pollination because it is not same flower. Yes or no? It is not the same flower as in autogamy. Isn't it? It is two different flowers on the same plant. Why they are genetically similar? Because the plant is the same. If the plant is the same, the genetic constitution is the same, since the pollen comes from the same plant. See the difference here? Because it is not the same flower, it is cross-pollination. Because it is the same plant, it is genetically similar. So a very rough representation of Xenogamy for you. This is one branch and this is another branch of the plant. This is the same plant. Okay. So in this, probably we'll consider it as the male flower with stamen is sitting on this branch. Then there is a neighboring flower. This flower is a neighbor of the first flower. It has pistil. with ovule inside. So where does the pollen come from? The pollen comes from the anther of a flower. It falls onto the stigma of another flower, but on the same plant. Isn't it? So flower 1 is producing pollen which gets deposited onto the stigma of flower 2. But is it two different plants? No, it is the same plant. So these two flowers, flower 1 and flower 2, are neighbors. They are present on the same plant. They are neighbors, okay? Xenogamy. Now, xenogamy is a completely different type from both autogamy and geitonogamy. It is called cross-pollination. You can imagine pollen from the anther lands on the stigma of a totally different plant. In the first case, it was same flower. In the second case, it was different flower, same plant. But now, in cross-pollination or xenogamy, it is entirely different plant. Significance of xenogamy: it brings genetically different types of pollen grain. It is good for a population because it brings about variation in the population. Isn't it? Pollen is coming from a different plant. The stigma belongs to a different plant. So let us represent it again as two diagrams. So this is plant 1. This is plant 2. Two different plants. Plant 1 and plant 2. On the plant 1, you find, imagine, it's not necessary that the plant has to be unisexual. It can be bisexual also. I mean the flower. So I'm showing both pistil and anther here. I'm showing the same kind of a flower here also, with both pistil and anther. See how the stamen and anther, the anther and stigma are exposed. Okay, so this is a plant 1, a different plant. This is a plant 2, a different plant. So pollen grain from the anther of plant 1 get deposited onto the stigma of not the same plant but plant 2. Isn't it? So this is called cross pollination. In cross pollination, please bear in mind, it is not the same plant, it is different plants are involved. Two flowers on two different plants. One of them is contributing the pollen which gets deposited on to the stigma of another flower. So this is called cross pollination or xenogamy. So this is a separate plant, this is a separate plant. Okay, I hope the concept is clear. How is pollination brought about? What are the different agents of pollination? The agents may be non-living such as wind and water in majority of plants, then we call them as abiotic agents. The agents may be living like in animals, it is called biotic agents. So majority of the plants use abiotic agents like wind and water. A few plants use biotic agents such as animals. In wind and water pollination, pollination is a chance factor. By chance, the pollen gets carried towards the stigma. So obviously you can imagine, if something is a chance factor, to increase the probability, to increase the chances of success, what is the plant doing? The plant is producing enormous amount of pollen in comparison to the number of ovule. We had learnt this in the chapter Reproduction of Organisms also, that if an organism exhibits external fertilization, it produces enormous amounts of male and female gametes. Why? To increase the chances of fertilization. So here also the wind doesn't know, the wind and water don't know that they are carrying it to some place. It happens by chance. By chance the pollen is carried by the wind or the water, and by chance it gets dropped onto the stigma. if there is a chance process to enhance the probability, to increase the chances of success, what should happen? There should be enormous amount of pollen. Okay? Now let us talk about wind pollination. The technical term for wind pollination is anemophily. Pollination that is mediated by wind is referred to as anemophily. Now for wind pollination, please learn the adaptation of the flowers. They may ask for a 3-mark question. If a pollen has to be carried easily by the wind, it obviously has to be light. It should not get stuck here and there onto surfaces, because the wind lashes onto surfaces also. So if pollination has to be successful, the pollen should be light and non-sticky. The stamen must be exposed, that is a rule. Otherwise, how will pollen be reaching the wind? The wind blows onto the stamen and the wind picks up the pollen because the stamen and the anther are exposed. Clear? Why should the stigma be feathery? Because when the wind blows onto the stigma, by chance the wind has pollen in it. If the stigma is feathery, then it can trap the pollen. So the feathery stigma helps in trapping the pollen. Generally the ovary of the female flowers in wind pollinated plants, they have a single ovule inside them to make the flowers very, very small. But all the flowers are packaged into a structure called an inflorescence. Please remember, the flowers have ovary with a single ovule and all of them are clustered into inflorescence, so that the pollination can happen in bulk. If there's one flower here and there, the chances that it may receive pollen is very, very less. When there are many, many ovules packed together, many flowers packed together, then you can increase the chances of pollination. There is no need to attract any honeybee or an ant or a moth or a wasp. So there is no need for the flowers to be colorful. There is no need for them to produce nectar. The best example of wind pollinated flowers are grass and corn. Okay? See how here this is a male flower and see all the stamen are sticking out into the wind. Sorry, these are not stigma, these are stamen. Why the stamen is sticking out like this? So that when the wind blows, what can the stamen release? The stamen can release the anther which is carried by the wind. And see how the flower has become compact like an inflorescence. And all the stamens, so probably it is a male inflorescence with only the stamen. So the stamen are exposed, so that when the wind blows onto the stamen can liberate the pollen grain. Now this is in the case of corn or maize. This is the female flower of the corn. See how compact the female flower is? Such a female flower is called a corn cob. And the stigma of all the flowers is bundled into a silk-like structure which is called a tassel, or it is called corn silk. See, all the female flowers are arranged in the form of a cob and all their stigma form a bundle on top, a hairy bundle, a hairy mass which is called tassel or corn silk. You can imagine when the wind is coming on to them, what do they bring with them? Pollen grain. And because they have such hairy stigma, they will trap the pollen grain that is brought by the wind. So please remember, cob represents a female inflorescence. To be more precise, it's an inflorescence in the corn plant. It is borne above the ground level but towards the base of the plant. Clear? The corn cob has a tuft of hair called the tassel or the corn silk. What is this tassel or the corn silk? They represent the stigma, tuft of stigma. Why is the stigma exposed like that? So that it can trap the pollen that is brought by the wind. So this is the adaptation that we see in wind pollinated flowers. So pollination by wind is referred to as anemophily. Okay? The next one is pollination by water. We call it as hydrophily. It is quite rare. It is restricted to only about 30 genera. Most of them are monocotyledons. However, if you go to early plants like algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes, they depended a lot on water, but it becomes rare in flowering plants. Like I said, it is restricted only to 30 genera in monocotyledons. In higher plants, we are going to learn pollination in higher plants like Vallisneria, which is in which pollination happens on the surface of the water. Another example is Hydrilla. Both of them are freshwater, and one member, which is a marine member, which is called the Zostera, where pollination happens underwater. So please, for your syllabus, you should remember we are going to learn pollination in Vallisneria that happens on the surface of the water, and pollination in Zostera, which is the marine grass in which pollination happens underwater, that is in submerged conditions. However, you will be surprised to know that in majority of the aquatic plants, like in the case of water hyacinth or eichhornia and water lily or nymphea, even though they are growing in water, their flowers project out of the water surface, their flowers grow out of the water surface, and they are pollinated by insect or wind, just like land plants. So don't think all water plants depend on water for pollination. There are some water plants like water hyacinth and water lily which depend on insects and wind for the process of pollination. Okay? Now let us see how pollination is brought about by water in Vallisneria. Please remember, it is on the water surface. Even though the plant is growing inside water, pollination happens on the water surface. I want you to see the first diagram here, in which they have shown a female flower. All of you remember, when the female flower matures, it has a long stalk which will grow and grow and grow, and the female flower will be brought to the surface of the water. It will no longer remain inside, so it grows and the female flower reaches the water surface. This is the first step. Please remember, the female flower is born on an elongated stalk which grows and grows, and once the female flower is mature, where is it brought? It is brought to the surface of the water. Clear? So now these ripples are the water surface. These rounded black colored, dark dotted lines represent the water surface. This is the female flower. See, it has reached the water surface. And this is the stigma. These leaf-like structures are the stigma. You know that the stigma is the part of the female part, that is the pistil. Can you see these tiny flowers which are floating closer to the female flower? See, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the male flowers. That means the male flowers are also coming to the surface, but they are not having a stalk. They are detached. They are produced inside, they get detached, and they come to the surface of the water. And see, the male flower is carrying enormous amount of what? Enormous amount of pollen. Then you can imagine, when the male flower comes and collides with the female flower, the water current will allow the male flower to collide with the female flower. You can imagine what gets deposited onto the stigma. The pollen gets deposited onto the stigma. This is how pollination is mediated in Vallisneria on, is it underwater or surface of water? It is on the surface of water. Okay, so all of you look at the first picture here. The female flower reaches the surface thanks to the elongated stalk. Once the female flower reaches the surface, who surrounds her? The male flower surrounds her. Who brings the male flower closer to the female flower? Passive water currents. The male flower is carried passively by water currents closer to the female flower. And the male flower has lot of pollen on it. And then once they come closer, they are brought together, the pollen get dusted onto the stigma of the female flower. That means the pollination is successful. Please remember, everything here happens on the surface of the water. The female flower comes to the surface. The male flower is detached. It is not having a stalk. But like I told you, the female flower has an elongated stalk which is helping it to reach the surface. The male flower is detached and it floats on the water surface, and it is carried passively closer to the stigma of the female flower. So I hope the mechanism of hydrophily in Vallisneria is clear. In sea grasses like Zostera, pollination happens underwater. Please remember, it is not on the surface of water, it happens underwater. So let us see how it happens. The grass is attached to the underwater. So this is the surface of the water, and this is the grass. It has tape-like leaves. One of the tape-like structures have flowers on them. So let me magnify this tape-like structure. Flowers are highly reduced. The male flowers are only anthers, and the female flower is only a pistil with an elongated stalk-like stigma with one ovule inside. So what are these? These are the anther, which represents what part of the flower? The male flower. And this is the pistil, which represents what part? The female. This elongated structure is the stigma. See how the stigma is sticking out into the water, correct? Okay. So this is the inflorescence, the cluster of flowers that you find on one of the blades of this grass, which is called Zostera. So now let us see how pollination happens. Let me again draw the inflorescence. So this is the anther. Let me show two anthers, and let me show one pistil with an elongated stigma with ovule sitting inside. Now what happens is the anther will break open. When the anther breaks open, it liberates into the water a coiled, an elongated, a ribbon-shaped pollen grain. See how the pollen grain is? It is like a thread or a ribbon. Now this pollen grain will still be inside water. It is carried passively by the water current, and by chance the pollen grain will reach the stigma, and once it reaches the stigma, it coils around the stigma. See how it is coiling around the stigma. And that means what has happened? Pollination has happened. Yes or no? So the pollen grain which was released by the dehiscence of, please remember, these male flowers are highly reduced. They don't have petal or sepal, they just have anther, and this is the female flower which is called the pistil. Isn't it? So the male flower, the anther, which is the male part, will dehisce. It will release this elongated ribbon-like pollen which will float inside the water. Nothing happens on the surface. Everything happens underwater. Very important. And then this pollen gets intertwined with the elongated, what is this structure? This is the stigma of the female flower. It gets intertwined with the stigma of the female flower, and that means what has successfully happened? Pollination has successfully happened. Pollen is released in water, carried by passive, but here the pollen is very, very elongated, and it is like a ribbon or a thread-like structure. It goes and encircles or intertwines around the stigma. Please remember, this is how pollination happens. I am repeating this again and again, not on the surface of water, but underwater in case of marine grass, that is Zostera. So like I said, pollen are long and ribbon, and they are carried passively by the water, and they get, so this is the pollen grain, and this was the pistil with an elongated stigma, and the pollen grain reaches the stigma accidentally by water current, and it gets intertwined around the stigma. Okay, So this was how pollination happened in marine grass or Zostera. The pollen grains in all these plants which depend on water for pollination, they are protected from wetting. If they get wet, they get decayed. So how are they protected from wetting? By a sticky substance that covers them, which also which also helps them float around in the water, and this sticky substance is referred to as the mucilage. Water pollinated flowers, they also don't have to attract any honeybee or ant or wasp or anybody, therefore they are not very colorful and they do not produce nectar. The third type of pollination is pollination by means of insects, and this technically, whenever insects bring about pollination, we call this process as entomophily. Okay, entomophily is pollination mediated by insects, such as bees, such as butterflies, wasps, ants, and moths. If you want these insects to bring about pollination, you have to make sure that they visit the flower again. You have to reward them. So the flower is very large. Again, adaptations for 3 marks. Adaptation of insect pollinated flowers. The flowers are very large, and most importantly, they are colorful. They have a lot of fragrance to attract the insects. Some of them have foul odor also, and they are very, very rich in nectar, because they need to, let us use a better word here, to reward. Please come again, isn't it? So visit me again, because I have a lot of exciting things for you, such as color, fragrance. I'm giving you a lot of nectar. So you need to reward the pollinator, because they are giving you a service of pollination. Generally, the flowers are grouped into inflorescence in this case also, because at one time many flowers get pollinated. The same way in wind pollination, in one go you are achieving pollination for many flowers. And also they should be made very obvious to the insects. Insects should be seeing them very clearly. Therefore, they are all collected in an inflorescence. Sometimes I told you the flower also produces foul odor in the case of flies and beetles. Apparently, they love foul odor. They don't like fragrance. And some of the flowers, to make sure that the animal visits again, please come again. So how do they visit again? If you give them a lot of pollen and if you give them a lot of nectar, they're very happy. They will keep visiting the flower again and again, and they will make sure that pollination happens from one season to the next. So these are the adaptations that are seen in flowers which undergo pollination by insects. To harvest the rewards, first the animal visits the flower. When it visits the flower, it gets dusted with pollen. It has visited one flower. In an attempt to get the reward, it gets dusted with pollen. And then it visits the second flower. And when it visits the second flower, whatever pollen is present on its body, it comes in contact with the stigma of that flower. That means what is brought about? Pollination is brought about. See here. This is honeybee visiting flower 1. When it is visiting flower 1, it is collecting the pollen. When it visits flower 2, it is depositing the pollen onto, this is the stigma, the stalk of the stigma. At the tip you have the stigma. So flower 1, it collects the pollen. Flower 2, when it visits again, whatever pollen it has collected voluntarily or whatever pollen has become dusted on its back, it comes in contact with the stigma and it brings about pollination. In some flowers which are massive, like for example, see a person is standing next to it. It is almost 6 feet tall. This is called Anemophilous. Some of these flowers, how do they reward their insects? By allowing their insects to lay eggs inside them. See how fascinating it is. So the tallest flower, that is Anemophilous, which is 6 feet tall, allows its insect pollinators that please, you have your place, you have a safe nest, a breeding haven inside me, so you can lay your eggs. I will protect your eggs. In turn, you are carrying out pollination for me. Okay? There is a very, very unique relationship between a plant called yucca and a moth. The relationship is so deep that the moth cannot live without the plant and the plant cannot reproduce without the moth. Why? Because the moth lays her eggs in the locule of the ovary. Let me show you the ovary here. Say this is the ovary. You all know that the ovary is the expanded portion. The chamber inside the ovary is called the locule. Ovule is sitting inside the locule. Now the moth comes over here. Okay, now the moth has reached the ovary of the flower. What is she carrying with her? Now before that, what she does is she will make a hole in the ovary. Inside the hole, she will deposit her eggs. See how she is laying her eggs inside the locule of the ovary. Don't think she is very selfish, because after she has laid her egg, she carries pollen grain. She has already brought pollen grain from another flower. So once she lays her egg inside the locule, she will go up to the stigma and make sure that whatever pollen she brought from another flower is deposited onto the stigma of this particular flower. Okay, so there is egg inside. She laid the egg inside the ovary, and then she has brought pollen. The pollen that she has brought will be deposited onto the stigma by her. Very faithfully, she will lay the egg, and she will not just run away after that. She will go up to the stigma and she will deposit the pollen grain that has brought to the flower from a different flower. Did you understand what is this relationship all about? Okay. The flower in turn gets pollinated. So not only did she lay her egg inside the locule, but she also faithfully deposited the pollen onto her stigma, onto the stigma of the flower. See, this is the moth, and this is the stigma, and this is the ovary of the flower. Inside the ovary, the ovules are there. Somewhere inside here only she lays her eggs. Now see, she is probably collecting pollen from the anthers. These are the anthers. She is collecting pollen from them. Then she will go to a different flower which has just bloomed, and there she will deposit the pollen onto the stigma of that flower. Now what happens? Successfully pollination is done. So her eggs are inside. Larvae come out of her eggs. Her eggs are hatching. At the same time her eggs are hatching, what is formed inside the ovary? The seed has developed. How did the ovule become seed? Because the pollination was a success. Pollination was a success, and after pollination, fertilization happened, and that resulted in the formation of a seed. So by the time the worms hatch out, the larvae of the moth are called caterpillar. By the time her larvae hatch out, the plant is also very happy, because the plant has a seed developing inside. And all thanks to, the seed is all thanks to whom? The female moth, who deposited the pollen grain onto the stigma of the flower. Clear? So this is the entomophilic relationship that we see in yucca and this moth. The next one is pollination by any other animal other than insect. It is referred to as zoophily. By biotic agents other than insects. Like we saw in insects, we called it entomophily, but in zoophily, it is other than insects. For example, birds like sunbirds and hummingbird, even primates, higher animals like lemurs, and tree-dwelling rodents, arboreal rodents, and even lizards, reptiles like gecko and garden lizard is known to carry out pollination in plants. So all this comes under zoophily. Even for them, the flower may show certain adaptations to particular species which help them to pollinate the flowers. They also should need certain rewards, isn't it? Otherwise, they will not visit the flower and they will not carry out pollination. For example, in this picture, you can see a bird pollinating. Broadly speaking, it is zoophily, but specifically pollination by bird is called ornithophily. Just like that, a snail that is pollinating. Broadly speaking, it is zoophily. Specifically, it is called malacophily. Okay? So, what did we learn today? We learnt about pollination, types of pollination, autogamy, Geitonogamy, xenogamy, significance of xenogamy, that it brings genetically different pollen, creates genetic variation. We learnt about agents such as wind, anemophily, water hydrophily. In wind, we learnt about adaptations. In water, we learnt about two plants, Vallisneria, pollination happening on the water surface, and Zostera, pollination happening under the water surface in submerged water. Then we saw insects adaptation. We saw how there is insect pollination in plants, in flowers like the largest Anemophilous, the tallest flower, and we saw a very nice relationship between the moth and the yucca flower. And lastly, we learnt about pollination by animals. So now in homework, we will be discussing about uh, some very important questions you will be writing in the homework. First one is define pollination. Then comes differentiate autogamy and Geitonogamy for 2 marks. Then what is xenogamy and mention its significance. Then I had told you Cleistogamous flowers produce assured seed set even in the absence of pollinator. Why? Explain the Vallisneria and Zostera pollination for a 5-mark essay type question. Characteristics of wind pollinated flowers. Characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. In normal flowers which open and expose their anther and stigma, complete self pollination or autogamy is rare because you have to think about the obvious reason. The answer lies in the fact that the anther and the stigma are exposed. When the anther and the stigma are exposed, why complete self pollination is rather rare? So think about it, you will get the answer. With this, we will complete the lecture 3 of sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Thank you.